Hi, everyone. I haven't been part of this event yet. Leonardo Bonanni, I'm the founder and CEO at Sourcemap, and we're thrilled to have everyone here for our fifth edition of the Supply Chain Transparency Conference. And I am joined, this is the panel you've all been waiting for. This is the Tariff panel. Um, we are joined by our partners at Ernst Young, specializing in tariffs. Ashish, Sinha, and Jeroen Truin are both partners at EY in Switzerland, specializing in various trade issues and tariffs. We also work together on other trade issues now that we know that a lot of sustainability laws are actually managed as trade issues. But today we're going to focus on the very exciting world of tariffs. And so I wanted to give you both a chance to introduce yourselves as individuals, and then also EY as a practice and what you offer to help companies deal with this very fast moving landscape of tariff regulations in both Europe and the US. So I don't know if Jeroen, you want to start?
Thanks, Leo, and a pleasure to be here with you for the second time on your annual conference. So I'm a partner, as Leo said, based in Switzerland, but as you can hear, originally Dutch by background, moved between the Netherlands and eventually to the US and back to the Netherlands and eventually ended up in Switzerland. And I actually do two things. We do operating model transformations, and what is the biggest driver for change? 2, 3, 4 years ago, started with sustainability. And that required also significant efforts to get more transparency in your supply chain. And if we look at, hey, what are big drivers for change? And nowadays, then we talk about tariffs. And I focus especially on the interaction that we have in the supply chain, whether we talk about the broader operational supply chain or even on the tax side, such as transfer pricing. Then together with my colleague Ashish, who is really a customs deep expert. So Ashish, over to you.
Thanks, Jeroen, and thanks, Leo, for inviting us. Nice to meet you all. So my name is Ashish Sinha. I'm partner based in Geneva office of EY. I have worked in the field of customs and global trade for almost 23 years now, been with EY for almost 21 years. And my team's work is mainly around managing and ensuring that the global trade aspects are considered when you're doing any kind of transformation, and also more so these days when you are dealing with any kind of ESG regulations, because a lot of regulations are driven by, let's say, the fundamentals of customs like HS code and origin of the goods. So between me and Jeroen, we kind of complement the both worlds from tax, transfer pricing, direct tax, and customs side, so that, let's say, the world works better from a tax and operating model perspective. So nice to meet you all.
Great. Thanks both. I'm going to give you a chance. If you want to share any slides, you can go ahead and load those up. But I think some of what certainly our audience cares the most about is, from your expert perspective, understanding first and foremost, what are there's a lot of news around tariffs, but what, if anything, is fundamentally different, or what has actually changed? So I'll let you either address that or go through any slides that you may have.
Sure, I will share some slides in a moment, but Jeroen, why don't you start with the main key trends?
Yeah, so I think that when we start talking about tariffs like 5 years ago, then most companies were saying, okay, yeah, that's something for my customs team. And you were lucky if the customs team was actually on top of the HS code classification. So it all starts with, hey, every single good has been classified and has a code linked to it. So it starts with material codes and then being linked to HS codes. And 5 years ago, I think everyone was in the organization, hey, if I can put in 6 times 0 and the goods get through, then probably it makes sense as well. The world was, of course, with the broader globalization going into less and less tariffs. And I think over the last decade or the last couple of years, you see a reverse trend whereby also for geopolitical purposes, tariffs have become really important. And we see that, of course, also, especially in the US broader relationships. So I think if you look at the interaction that we're having right now, where tariffs were not really important in the broader scheme of things, of course it was important because you need to have a classification, you need to still do like your customs valuation, and some products were of course always subject to tariffs. So it was important, but so many companies were actually exempt on many trades. So it was then about, okay, do I have the right value attached to it? And that was of less important because there was no customs duty due on certain products. Now, with the current different trend in the world, this become completely different, of course. So what we see, especially in the discussions, and I already alluded to some of the sustainability regulations that we have here in Europe, which are HS code driven. It started already to become more important for most companies to say, hey, I need to get that in sync because I need to understand, hey, where do I have which kind of impact? So you can imagine if you trade between Europe and US or between Europe and elsewhere, that at that moment in time, the custom classification started to become important. And we see companies being extremely good at it. And we see companies completely behind the curve in the sense that, hey, they may have only 10% of the material codes classified. So we see a lot of updates happening, and that happens still partially manual, but also with modern technology, with AI, so that eventually you get into a faster custom classification and it's learning from its mistakes. And now with, of course, the global trade tensions that are out there, and also the tariffs, you see that not only for the ESG regulations it became important, but especially on, hey, how do I understand what is my impact when I start exporting goods that are destined to the US markets? And then second, hey, is that correct, what I actually had classified? Because that will determine quite a lot. And we'll come back to the origin management as well, because it's eventually, hey, or your custom classification, that is a really important consideration. So you get into the whole broader discussion on, hey, what is eventually the tariff discussion? Now, Ashish, I think you put on a nice slide, and I think we can break that down into 3 categories. So over to you.
No, thanks, Jeroen, for explanation. And as you rightly said, normally the custom duty and customs tariff is typically a very stable tax. So it is not exposed to a lot of changes as WTO agreement, and globally, the duty rates are normally not changing very often. And the trend is always towards the going down and bringing it down to, let's say, between 3 to 5% customs tariff. That was kind of agreement among WTO members. But this has changed in last 3-4 months, or ever since the new world order was established from US, that tariff and trade also becomes, let's say, a means for other geopolitical aspects. So in reality, what happened, I think we saw this a bit also from Brexit, the importance of customs when you do certain activities or acts which actually leads to either creation of a customs border or creation of new customs tariff. That requires a lot of alignment of business with a changed order. Now, what you see here is that when I'm not going to the details of what kind of tariffs were introduced in last few months, but most of you must be aware about the US reciprocal tariff, which, let's see, ranged across from 10% all the way up to 150% for China. And this is the example of some countries. As you can see that it varies across the country, and these are like reciprocal tariff on all importation. So the big question is that, okay, now that the tariffs are there and it doesn't look like it's going to go away, what exactly is tariff, and what impacts the tariff? How do you really calculate? The tariffs that you saw for US is, and in generally across the world, is based on 3 factors. Classification of the product, and that's mainly driven by what is the nature of the product. And sorry, you still see my screen? No.
We saw it, but you took it now off.
No, I can bring it back. So basically, I was. Okay. So, sorry, just to come back to the same, I will try to share the slide as soon as I figure it out. Because the main factor was, there were three factors as I was mentioning. One is the classification of the product, which means how all the products across the world are classified with a specific HS code. And these codes are based on certain rules and product characteristic. And that's basically how you come to a tariff rate. And the second important factor is the origin of the product. And these days it becomes even more important because of where the goods originate from determines what tariff will be imposed when the goods are entering US market. Earlier, we would be using tariff, the origin of the goods to determine which free trade agreements apply so that you get a lower tariff. But nowadays, it's more about origin determining what kind of duty rate will be applicable for the US tariffs. And the third one is more about the valuation. And that's where the tax and custom valuation interact a bit more. So maybe Jeroen, you can talk a bit about the third part, especially.
Yeah, no, and just an observation in the market, right? So I think what we see on those three components, because imagine that Ashish is selling to me and I'm selling to Leo. So I'm based today in London. So and then I'm selling to Leo for the price of 100. And with no tariffs, we were not really interested in whether it was like 90 or 100 or 110. But nowadays, if we have a transaction that is worth 100, you want to know, first of all, is the classification correct? So that it starts with what Ashish was mentioning. So if I have a cup in my hand, which is really difficult to see, but you want to make sure that the HS code classification is correct, because that will also determine, hey, to which kind of subject, to which kind of duty rate you're subject. Then second, even though that Ashish is based in Switzerland and sells to me, who is currently in London, if I sell to Leo, that origin is so important. Because based on the latest discussion and the latest, of course, publications, 10% is due on the origination out of the UK. So if we talk about 10% of 100 is different than if something comes out of Switzerland, which has currently a rate of 39%. They have, of course, 10 duty versus 39. So the origination management and understanding where goods are really coming from is super important. And it's not only where they're coming from, because where you come from is not the same as your origin. It's really about the material modification that happens throughout the supply chain. So having that visibility on your supply chain becomes really important there. Now, the third component that Ashish just mentioned is, which is the price. So if I sell to Leo for 100, that would normally be the price. Now, we know something, and Ashish will explain that in more detail than I can, something about first sale for export. So if Ashish was selling to me for the price of 50 and I'm selling for 100, if I pay the 10% or the 39% over the 100, or I pay that over the first sale, which is the price that Ashish is actually selling it to me over 15, is completely different. So you get a significant discussion on, hey, what is eventually the price for a good and what is the relevant price for customs purposes? And there you get a whole discussion on the overall operating model and transaction model and the transfer pricing interaction, because I still want to sell, because that is the right price, to Leo for 100, but for customs purposes, I want to reduce that value. So there you get into, hey, okay, do you get that into a lower price? And maybe Ashish, this picture illustrates that nicely, I think.
Exactly. So that Leo asked us about the trend, what you see in the market, what's happening. So the immediate reaction when the US tariffs were introduced, it's not easy to change the classification of the product or the origin of the product to go to a different tariff. But what is something that especially the large multinationals can do is look at the value at which they are trading. And especially for the large multinationals, because they work on operating model which has certain transfer pricing guidelines. So immediate reaction is obviously to make sure that the distributor in US is still making profit, which means you have to reduce the value at which you sell. And eventually look at your operating model and figure out which is the best value to declare as per the US customs laws. So that's kind of the main idea of first sale for export, Leo.
Great,
And
thank you. And I'm gonna let you keep going. I just want to address two things that you've mentioned for this audience. As we know, supply chain mapping, visibility, transparency, they came out of another world, and now it seems like tariffs are probably the most clear and urgent return on investment for knowing your supply chain. And there's two dimensions that I know EY works on quite a bit with companies, and one you've mentioned already, the HS code, the customs codes, classifying products, components of products, and the raw materials in those products, depending on the tariff uh, regulation. So one side of it is getting to understand the bill of materials and the individual transactions in some cases that are involved in the supply chain. And then the other one is this whole question of what is origin in this world where some of the tariffs actually apply not to where a product came from necessarily, but where the raw materials may have been refined.
Mm.
So I wonder if you could give the audience a little bit more on these two. I guess what is making HS code mapping more complex, but also automating has become
Mhm.
possible now, and then also what is making origin determination more complex, and how are companies automating that?
Okay. So, very varied questions because, as you rightly said, it's a HS code and the origin we determine. So let's look at the HS code first because that's where the whole uh, this is fundamental of customs tariff. Even before the US tariff came into more popularity, it was how the customs world works. So typically, when you are declaring goods to custom at a custom border, yeah, you have to declare the correct classification. That's the responsibility of the importer. Now, most of the companies, when they do, so companies transact in, let's say, huge number of products, and they are all captured in their material master data. A material master data is a repository of all the material SKUs, whether it's produced by the company or purchased by the company in their material master data. They have a material code description, material type, categories. Based on that, typically material master should have all the information regarding that specific SKU or material code. And that those information should also include, for example, the origin of the goods, which country it originates from, and secondly, the HS code. And depending upon how complex and diverse is your IT landscape, it may happen that you have this for each country or each company code. The more centralized, the better. So what, in our experience, what we saw, that companies can have millions of lines of material codes with a material code description, and they can be in multiple languages. They can also be just minutely different because of the, let's say, the dimension or the quantity or volume, but they are essentially same. So the big task is to, especially in the light of these tariffs and also the ESG regulation, is to one, classify those products as per the applicable customs rule and come up with a 6 to 8 digit classification number.
and
Now,
I
how
can
to do that?
just to give
Yes.
you an example, right? So Ashish and I were on the way to a client meeting, and it was around Christmas time. And Ashish said, "Hey, look at the left. Do you see two different Christmas trees, right? So one is cut and the other one is not cut." And he is explaining to me that those classifications for the customs trees are completely different. So one has a code that is ending on 060984, and the other one was like 08 or something like this. And if you look it up, and also the importance of it, because one was duty exempt and the other one was subject to duty. So you get into every single living and non-living item is subject to a specific HS code. And that goes into extreme detail. And what we see little now in the market is, besides, and I think Leo, to answer also the question, hey, ensuring that those are right and making sure that you also do that with modern technology, because hey, to go through like 700,000 or 1 million or 2 million or 5 million, depending on the company, different material codes with different HS codes is quite an activity. But also making sure that what you do is correct, because the impact could be significantly different. And there you see also a lot of disputes in the market, because if I was selling to you, Leo, you may have a different understanding of, hey, what the classification is than my understanding. So it becomes more and more important also on the documentation on what is it and how do you actually characterize the specific goods or material and then the right classification to it. Sorry, Ashish, over back to you because I just
That's
wanted to
a
give that
good
specific
example
example.
indeed. Happy that the customs and HS code is gaining more popularity among non-customs people as well. So that's good. And because the HS code classification are typically a mass number of data which needs to be processed, so we use both AI and machine learning, as well as the human resources who are actually experts in customs. So basically, sometimes it's mostly a mix of both. AI to do the first round of cleaning and assigning the codes, and the second round where we have less degree of confidence, then we look at those codes from a more customs angle that to assign the right HS code. So that's the HS code. But and Leo, you asked about the origin. So why I picked up HS code first is because the origin determination is also based a lot on which HS codes have you classified correctly or not. Because you mentioned bill of material. Now, bill of material itself would have maybe depending upon complexity of product, it can have 10, 20, 50 different products. And each of those products should also have HS code. And those products should also have a country of origin assigned to it. Because depending upon the product and country of origin, you can make a calculation if it's a free trade agreement or if it's a US tariff based on determining where is the substantial transformation has happened. So which means bill of material would also have the labor cost and other material cost which are going into the finished product. So the origin determination, now let's take the US tariff for us for a moment. There you are following a rule which is called non-preferential rules of origin. Now, non-preferential rules of origin typically, well, in very simple term, means if the product is naturally occurring in a country, coffee, cocoa, natural rubber, so they are considered as originating in that country. But normally it doesn't happen like that. You have processed products. So there, custom authorities will look at if the product is produced from goods of multiple sources, then you need to look at where has the last substantial transformation has happened. Now, in order to prove that, there are certain guidelines, criteria, court rulings which determine what do you mean by last substantial transformation. And that generally means that name, classification, and form of the product has changed so much that it has become a new product. In order to prove that, you need to have the right bill of material, you need to have the right HS code, and the right country of origin, and the cost of labor attributed to a country where the last processing is happening. So all this calculation and let's say the customs legal reasoning comes together to determine the origin of a product when we look at the bill of material. So sorry, Leo, it's a bit technical or sounds complicated, but I need to go into this detail.
I think it makes a ton of sense, but also it gets to the magnitude of the problem, right? So you have millions of HS codes or material descriptions in a company organized into bills of materials where different materials come together and components to make finished goods. And then tracking where all of those subcomponents come from, that's really where the sub-tier or N-tier mapping comes into force. Again, assigning different origins to different subcomponents means you're managing a very large graph database. And then on top of that, value add along the way, whether it's processes, IP, labor, so additional lines of data that need to be tracked. And I think what you're also getting to is there needs to be a system of record and some sort of an audit trail here where all of these calculations have been documented and substantiated in the event that there was to be any question about the determination of tariff exposure. So certainly makes a case for any automation out there, automated mapping, automated bill of materials, disambiguation, AI to clean the data, and then a lot of expert services to assign valuations, assign HS code determinations, and really determine what the right strategy is for moving products around the world. Is there, from going back into sort of customer trends, so what is the biggest, what are the biggest issues that customers are coming to you with right now in 2025?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can start, and maybe Jeroen can jump in. So it's about when we look at it's more about when we look at the impact assessment. That's where the whole the first question is, and you can make a back of the envelope calculation. But when it comes to real investment and decision making process, the impact assessment requires some real hard data, and that's where the clients typically struggle, because these things, especially the back-end data, was not really something that was it was not really necessary at some point of time, that you need to have all these elements that we discussed in place. So the impact assessment itself becomes a first hurdle to cross because of lack of data.
And to add to that, right? If I see what's happening in the market, I mean, it's for some companies, it's indeed impact assessment because they don't know what they don't know, right? And it depends on how good you already were. If you were having 13% of your goods classified, or you had 100% classified, if that person was able to push 6 times 0 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or that there was a whole like policy in place. So it depends a little bit of the company. What I really see a lot, and it goes either into, hey, I need to be compliant, or it goes into, hey, I see this as a strategic advantage or disadvantage. And let me explain that, right? So first of all, let me be compliant. You see that, and that's already what we said, hey, we need to have a value being attached to it. You need to know where it's coming from. You need to determine if you import into the US, the customs that you need to, depending on who's in the import of record, of course, the customs tariffs that needs to be paid. So that's where it's already from an cash and of course impact becomes really relevant. Then second, it is if you look at the more strategic things, and we saw that already happening in the past. There's still a significant demand at the customer side for transparency. So where is my milk coming from? Where is my cocoa coming from? So that you almost can go back to the plot of land, the specific farm holder, and that was a demand in the market. Now, then we had, especially from a European perspective, the requirement to give you that transparency throughout the supply chain. And everyone thinks with omnibus and maybe potential postponement of the European deforestation rules. And by the way, that is not uncertain, is not a given, because there's still like a lot of political discussions happening there. But what you still see is, even if there's a year delay, all the commonalities that you still have in those regulations, whether it's the digital product passport that is on the horizon, whether it's related to PPWR, so the plastic packaging and waste regulation, it all requires some form of transparency in your supply chain. So what some companies do, they are reactive and they say, okay, I just need to be, I need to pay tariffs, so I need to know what's the base, and I may need to be able to save something based on, for instance, the valuation discussion, the first of export. But there are companies out there, and there's more the leaders that they're saying, hey, look, I see the trend on the horizon, which means that I need to have the supply chain visibility, whether it's coming from a customer demand perspective, whether it's because I'm being pushed by regulators, or because I need to be ready for supply chain differentiation, because, hey, I need to know if something is coming from location A and subject suddenly to a tariff in day 4 from now, that I can bifurcate supply chains. So you get into a whole supply chain operationalization perspective where you need to know, hey, where are goods coming from? Can I change my supply chain routes? And that's not that easy, but it all requires having that visibility. And that's where you see still a lot of companies focusing on, because, hey, it serves multiple purposes.
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
Just to add complete because the traceability, even if you are implementing, for example, first sale for export, it requires full traceability of the whole, from how the goods moved, how it was directly shipped to the US, and how the other documentation can be traced all the way back from the demand from US and supply from the manufacturing plant. So it is all about traceability as well. Obviously.
And we're going to get into also some of the other regulations that you mentioned, Jeroen, that also require either interfacing with customs in a similar platform or method to tariffs, and or just a tariff-based way of thinking about other impacts, other risks associated with products. But I do want to give you a little bit of a window to talk about value determination. I know that the origin mapping is required, the HS determination is required, but there is a sort of an art to the valuation and assigning it. Are there any sort of anecdotes that you want to relay around where you help companies in assigning value?
Yeah. So, and I think that's spot on, because if you look at the current discussions in the market, and especially, for instance, the announcement on the pharmaceutical products, there might be 100% tariffs being entered into force. And Ashish can probably explain exactly whether this is already being placed in official papers or not. But it can change by the day. So what will happen is that companies not only on the long term need to look at their supply chain and think, hey, where do I manufacture, where do I source from? But also on the short term, hey, if I indeed sell to the US, hey, how do I make sure that the customs valuation is as low as possible? And that goes back to the valuation part. So we briefly discussed already the first sale for export, and Ashish also mentioned there are probably 5 criteria there. It needs to be destined for the US. It needs to be a bona fide sale. So the requirements that you eventually need to go through. Now, a lot of work that goes into, hey, are you meeting those requirements, and how can you make sure that you meet those requirements? Because again, if I can use the 50 as a basis or the 100 as basis, gives me a complete different discussion. And it also depends, of course, on the price elasticity of your product, to which extent you can pass on certain, like actually cost that you have incurred from a customs perspective. So imagine 2 comparable companies, and this is literally the case, that are selling goods towards the US, and one is able to use the first sale for export, and let's say is being charged on the 50, but the other company is not able to do that because they have manufacturing and they have the HQ in one legal entity. So there's no first sale before. The last company will try to push like actually the incremental cost that they incur towards like the customer, which may lead to inflation for eventually down the road. But you will see that they try, depending again on the price listing, to pass that on. Now, the first one that actually had only a cost of 50 will depend on the success of the first one towards extent you actually can pass those costs on. But you can already see that you can even create a value proposition there, that you can increase your prices for additional customs cost. Well, you're not completely incurring those because you pay over 50, not over 100. So there you get into quite interesting discussions on price setting and also proposition. And hey, how are your competitors dealing, or are your competitors sourcing goods, shipping goods, manufacturing goods? And if it's comparable from a supply chain perspective, yeah, you need to think about, hey, where can you actually get an advantage? And that's not only the first sale for export, but there are other elements, and that is the whole discussion on transactional value. So Ashish, walk us through this slide and help us to understand, hey, how do I actually determine value and the customer's value?
Thanks, Jeroen. It's difficult to focus on this slide because there are too many boxes here. So I will just say that just imagine that when you declare the goods to customs authorities, they are interested to see whether the goods are declared at the right value, whether it includes all the necessary elements which should be included in the customs valuation basis. And in a non-technical way, I would say that it should include all the cost of production, all the material which has gone into the production of the goods, all the labor cost, and any other, let's say, production-related IP, without which the goods could not be produced. So basically, the whole price, which any third-party manufacturer would be, selling it to the customer. So that's what customs look at. Now they also, so those are the additions that needs to be there. But on the with the same logic, customs is also not interested to impose customs duty on things which are not related to the goods, which are, let's say, intangibles which are not relevant for the production and sale of the goods. Or in case of US, overseas transportation freight, that is not relevant for customs. There are post-installation commissioning and warehousing activities which happen, which is happening which is a post-importation activity. Although the customer might be paying the full price on the invoice, which is used for the custom declaration, but it is not relevant for customs because then those activities happen after importation. So there are some of the examples that companies have started looking into, especially when the tariff rates are going up, because you would not like to pay custom duty unnecessarily on value or elements which are not relevant for custom purposes. Yeah.
And Ashish, maybe a question, right? Because I think the first silver export thing, and I explain it really simple, but it's not that simple, right? Because hey, how do you make sure that the price is correct, the 50 versus? So you get into all kind of discussions on, hey, how do you determine what the value of a good is for US customs purposes, and then using those three levers that we have: origin, classification, and valuation. So just on that last part, right? So how do you determine that 50?
So what happens is that when we are looking in case of first silver export, for example, when you're looking at the invoice from, say, manufacturing company in Malaysia, which is selling at in this case at 50, and the goods are actually sold to the US importer at 100, then what we will look at is factory invoice, whether it has all the right components of production. And typically, you are using it in a related party scenario. So, which means that you can actually look at what is the cost built up of the factory and what is the cost plus markup. Then you are also looking at what is the production related IP, which typically will not be charged by the related party manufacturer. So, we will look at the transfer pricing benchmark or any industry standard which shows this is typically the value of the production related IP which is necessary for the production of those goods, and we calculate and project it and then add upon as a separate addition on the customs value when goods are declared for custom purposes. So it goes a bit of some process before you actually use the first,
Yeah. So I wanted to make that point, right? Because Leo, you see that eventually it's about, hey, how do you determine it, and how do you, and you ask the question on, hey, you need to have documentation. Yes, you need to document that you meet all the requirements where most efforts are being put into, hey, how do you eventually determine that first sale value? And then especially that 20 that you see in the example is something that requires detailed understanding of the customs code, because that is where you really say, okay, it could be 20, could be 10, could be -5, but that's what you need to understand. That's where interaction with transfer pricing is becoming really relevant. And transfer pricing, just for everyone to understand, is, hey, how do you make sure that you have the intercompany price setting? So Ashish selling to me and me selling to Leo, that is at arm's length. And arm's length means, hey, as if you would sell it to a third party. So I would sell it to a third party in similar circumstances, and that's eventually the basis for that respective value.
Great, thank you. In the time we have left, I want to take a slight turn into, I know something that you're working on quite a bit, Jeroen, but for the first time, we're seeing the convergence of customs regulations. That was going back to 2020 and the US forced labor restrictions. We're seeing convergence of environmental regulations, EU deforestation regulation, and the cross-border carbon adjustment mechanism, CBAM, and potentially also the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. So all of those environmental regulations, all of these human rights regulations and tariffs converging. They all require mapping. They all require some amount of traceability and audit trail with documentation to substantiate the conditions in which products were made, subcomponents, and raw materials in many cases of those products. So the way that we see it at Sourcemap is actually now a much larger team at each company that is involved in supply chain transparency and collecting this data, analyzing it, reporting on it, and then also we're seeing a great convergence in terms of reporting. All of this data is now being reported much less in an ad hoc narrative way, much more through databases, portals, in some cases via automated connections like the API for the EU traces or for the automated commercial environment, the ACE, that US Customs and Border Protection runs. So where do you see, as far as company transformation, as far as technology transformation, as far as alignment of teams, how are you seeing the various regulations, customs, human rights, sustainability, and tariffs converge? What are the trends that again, the early adopters that you work with have exhibited, and where do you see it going next?
Yeah, so I think that there are two elements into that, right? And that is one, where's the responsibility? And it really depends. And I think I go back to, hey, are you a reactive company or do you see this as a value creation opportunity? But if you're a reactive company, that hot potato is being passed on from department to department because hey, it hits every single department. It hits legal, it hits like the supply chain team, it hits the procurement team, it hits the sustainability team, and it really depends on who's raising his or her hand and would be typically also responsible for it. Now that depends on a few companies and whether there are volunteers or not. Otherwise, you will see that that discussion continues and continues. Then you have other companies and where it's more a strategic proposition, and they see irrespective of its legal, sustainability, procurement, they see that as an opportunity to push value into the market. So it's more top C-level push down to the organization and say, hey, look, this is an important element. And we see some companies creating new departments or new functions. So someone that is having full responsibility of all those elements, because indeed, I'm 100% with you, Leo, it's all the interaction between all those components that you just mentioned that is having such a big impact on an organization. And if you see it as a compliant element, yes, you may actually want to cut it down in pieces and give everyone his or her responsibility, depending on the ratio, depending on the process maps. But other companies, it's more like, hey, I see this as a value proposition. I will set up someone that is responsible. Either I keep it with someone in the strategy team or keep it someone in the C-level team. But I see this as a value proposition where we need to move forward. Ashish, anything you have to add to that?
I would say that sometimes the regulation itself demands that you have a responsible officer and appointed department. So that has to, even if we don't want to, regulation requires you to do it.
Yeah, and if anything, some of the more strategic companies that we work with have had a whole IT team dedicated to supply chain transformation, and I know that they work with you in quite a number of cases. Great. Look, I think to wrap up this session, I think it's been super packed with information. If you have a crystal ball or if you have any indication as to how companies should prepare, either because you think something is going to happen or because you think anything could happen, where do you see 2026 taking us in terms of the world of tariffs? New regulations, new requirements that companies should face, get ready to face, or get ready to face.
Ashish, you want to take that first?
Yeah, generally you are the one with crystal ball, but let me try with mine. So, from a tariff perspective, I don't see that it's going away because what we will see more in 2026, I think, is my personal opinion that having 10 to 15% tariff is looking like a norm in US, which also could be reflected on a retaliation side that other countries will follow the same suit. So that could be some of that you will see, which also means that more pressure on the margin, which also means more pressure on doing the right thing from a customs declaration, classification, and validation perspective. So eventually, it all boils down to how good is your traceability, how good is your data, and how good you can predict and do the impact assessment, because that will determine your strategic direction. So this is what I see more happening in real terms in 2026.
Yeah, and then I think if I add to that, right, and I think you see some economic indicators that there are quite a few companies that say, hey, look, we need to focus on costs. And I think what is important to think about, hey, cost, where do you spend your money wisely? Because you can indeed normally only spend it once. What I would expect is that you have companies that say, hey, look, if I fast forward, I know that hey, there's a demand side, and I know that there's a regulatory side that will not go away. And we see that with regulations such as the plastic packaging tax, right? You saw that in the UK, Spain adopted it, and you see it with EPR. There are multiple countries adopting it, and it's spreading. It's coming more and more. Even in the US, there are 6 like states with EPR regulations. So what you will see is it's pausing a bit, but my prediction is, hey, it will continue and it will pick up again, and that is with also a good thing, right? Because I think many regulations were having too much overkill, and we normalize it a bit, but it doesn't mean that hey, the underlying trend is stopped. And the underlying trend for me is hey, increase transparency because it's a customer demand, it's a regulatory demand, and that is here to stay. So I see companies that see that as a strategic value proposition moving forward. And then you have companies that say, hey, look, it's a cost element and it's just compliance. It's not my core actually service offering. And they will pause and will drag on until the moment that they are pushed again. And I dare to say that the companies that are seeing that as one big overarching dot on the horizon and they go directly, they're probably more cost efficient on the long run than probably companies that stop, pause, go, continue, stop, pause, go, continue. And that's what we see already happening in the market.
Completely agree. I mean, if anything, it seems like the idea that you do tariffs episodically as a project every now and then is completely changed. We don't see people mapping supply chains once a year. We see them continuously mapping. We don't see the bill of material management pausing. I think what used to be almost on a production schedule is now a continuous process. And those companies that can do this in a more fluid, a continuous real-time way are able to actually get ahead of the problems and be strategic. Never mind, they can also bounce back a lot faster when there's a surprise tariff or any other supply chain disruption along the way. So we see a lot more, if not tariffs, reasons to keep tabs on the extended supply chain in great detail and to be fluid about where products actually are being sourced and value being added. Any last words before we move on to the next session on de minimis?
Most beautiful word of the dictionary, supply chain transparency, becomes the next one.
Great. Well, thank you both. Jeroen, Ashish,
thank you for having us.
Extremely valuable. I'm sure everyone appreciates it, and we'll make that recording available to everyone. And for everyone that's hanging out there, we'll resume in 4 minutes on the last session on the de minimis loophole elimination.